Hello, I am Paul Ndiho. Today, on Different Perspectives, we confront the significant changes within USAID and their far-reaching implications to Africa. The current administration's reduction in aid, particularly to crucial health programs like HIV and malaria medications, poses serious threats to the continent's well-being. However, this moment presents a unique opportunity for African nations to seize control of their economic futures and pursue self-reliance. U.S. Senior Advisor for Africa, Massad Boulos, recognizes Africa's value despite these obstacles. Sir Leonard Anyogo, a constitutional lawyer and political analyst based in Abuja, Nigeria, joins me in providing further insight. Welcome to Different Perspectives.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to always speak with you.
The United States plans to cut aid to most African countries. They have also indicated that they might be closing down some embassies across Africa. You've worked very closely with some institutions that do business here in the United States. You talk to people all the time. What should we expect? What kind of impact is this going to have on Nigeria and the rest of Africa?
It's a moment of introspection, of doing things differently. Structurally, some African countries depends on aid for survival, to attend to some issues affecting the African continent as a whole. But times and season changes. So right now, if the aid is not coming, Africa is blessed with a lot of resources. Now, it is time for the African leaders, including Nigeria, to look inward, to see how they can stay without foreign aid. Because if the African leadership is right, if the leadership is in proper perspective, that we harness our resources without taking this our natural resources outside to be refined and brought back to Africa, Africa will not depend solely on aid. Aid will just be like a palliative. Aid should be in a moment of emergencies. Aid should be on emergency situations like health challenges, epidemic, pandemic, and the rest. Not that you have to depend on aid to run your government, to run the African continent. Let's even take the challenges of Nigeria, for instance. Before now, we were importing refined products, petroleum refined products, when we have the natural resources. Imagine you have the natural resources, you are taking the natural resources outside and you are refining, you are still buying your own product. It's terrible. But that is changing now because we have a private refinery that's working, Dangote refinery. So it's a set that goes with other African countries, that resources should be harnessed and processed in Africa. Then aid will just be like an additional incentive. So things have changed. So it is a moment that we have to sit down like a continent and say, look, we cannot depend on aid any longer, solely depend on aid. We have to bring leadership to bear.
You seem to suggest that just like America is saying America first, Africa or Nigeria should say Nigeria first, then focus on producing things locally. But there are those people who are not in a position, like, for example, other countries on the continent that are not in a position to do some of the things that you're suggesting. To produce local stuff, they still have to depend on foreign aid. They still have to depend on other handouts just to get by. Nigeria is an exception. Nigeria is endowed with a lot of resources. It's one of the biggest economies on the continent, unlike most African countries.
The first law of nature is self-preservation. You must have to take care of yourself and survive as a human being. That is the first law of nature, self-preservation. Let me take you historically. Nigeria has played a big brother role in Africa. We supported the independence of Namibia, we were there in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and all those other countries. Now, Africa should be able to support Africa. A rich African state should be able to support another African state. Firstly, because traditionally in the African continent, there's this what we call the extended family system, where if you are doing well, you support your brother or your sister that is not doing well. That is palliative, but it doesn't mean that your brother or sister should be lazy. So it is a moment of introspection for African leaders. I'm talking about the continent now to say, look, we have the resources. What does it take to establish manufacturing plants in Africa? I think that's the major problem. We are not manufacturing. We are only consuming. Most Africans say it's a consuming entity. You have the resources, you take it outside, then process it and bring back. So until we have that manufacturing spirit in Africa, then we'll be able to say, look, palliative aids are just an addendum. We cannot depend. So that's why I said on the other side of it, it's good that these aids are being cut off. How do we sustain? We should be able to sustain ourselves by being more creative and being people's friendly centered leadership in Africa.
I get your point, and I agree with you. But are you suggesting that we have a leadership deficit problem?
Absolutely. Without missing words, I can tell you that. Most of African leaders sit tight. Whether it is a constitutional democracy or even a dictatorship, they don't want to leave office. There are so many African leaders that have been there for 90, 50 years, 40 years, 30 years. They are there. And so when you have those things, there's no competition. The opposition is killed. So the essence of governance is to provide leadership. Now, the problem we have in Africa, I keep saying, is still leadership deficit. Now, where one man will stay in office for 30 years, I shouldn't be, but of course, these are facts. You have them in Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and the rest. They have been there for years. And then the kind of democracy we even practice, where you don't allow the opposition to even thrive. Those are all indices or indications for political instability that result to all these refugee camps they are saying. So we need in Africa to get the leadership right. And the beautiful example is the late President Nelson Mandela, that only presided over South Africa for 4 years. He had the opportunity of doing a second term, but he gave up because he wasn't sound enough. That is leadership, sacrificing yourself for the continent. And that's why I said, if this is even cut off from Africa, we are going to look inwards. Look at countries like Rwanda, after the genocide, after their war. It's one of the most developed African countries in Africa right now. Other countries go there for seminars. Rwanda, they came from a civil war, a genocidal war, but the country is even more developed than some other countries that have been in peace. Now, that's the good aspect of it, but staying long is a different ball game. He has stayed long, and I don't subscribe to African leaders staying forever in office. That is not my position at all. That's where African leadership comes to play. We have the natural resources. We have the human resources. We have the ambience. So Africa should not be relying on aid solely. Aid should be like an emergency situation. Look, for instance, Nigeria is blessed. Nigeria as a country is blessed with natural resources. We have almost all the minerals. But we agree that we've not had very good leadership. We are trying. So when we get leadership right, Nigeria will explode across the globe positively. So that is what happens in most other African countries too. Once they get the leadership right, the African continent will be a force to reckon with, because we have the resources, we have the human capital. It's to harness this.
To your point, you talked about some of these leaders who have overstayed their welcome. In some cases, some of these leaders have argued that they are the only solution to bringing about development, whether it's economic development, rural development, that they alone have the solutions to take their countries to the next level. Your thoughts?
It's quite unfortunate. Look, I have interacted with some African leaders across the globe. When they are in Africa, they feel they know it all. I've sat across some African leaders in the Chatham House in London, and at that point, they will humble themselves and they will allow you to talk, allow you to express themselves. But when they come home, they behave like emperors. That is the pain of leadership in Africa, where one man feels that he knows it all. I was talking to an African leader, and he said, look, before he said, I know this. You don't think like that. If you think like that, that means you will not allow opposition. You will not even allow people to share ideas with you. That is one of those bad indices of leadership in Africa, where one man believes that he knows it all. He knows science, he knows physics, he knows law, he knows every other aspect. Then, of course, there's no division of labor. Because in constitutional democracy that some African countries practice, there's supposed to be separation of power. The legislative arm should be separate. the executive arm and the judicial arm. But unfortunately in Africa, the executive arm tend to control both the judicial arm and the legislative arm. That's why you have despots in Africa. Some African leaders, with the greatest respect, are despots. They are very despotic in nature. How they behave, they believe they know it all. They want to control the other arms of government. And so when you have that, you have this kind of insecurity around you that you don't want any other person to contribute idea. Even the parliament, most African parliament is controlled by the executive arm. So when you have that, you will not have real development in Africa. And that's why I said, once the executive arm, when there are checks and balances on the executive arm, development will come. Leadership will be developed in Africa until we get to that point. And I think this is the time now, because we have for over a long time, we have been depending on this foreign aid. We have come of age. Let us take care of ourselves. Let us ask for assistance. Let us not rely on assistance.
There are those who have argued that foreign assistance, as it were, is not a bad thing, but it's how it's used. It's how, when this aid comes in, how it's reallocated to different parts of the country. A lot of people don't have issues with aid coming in, but it's how it's controlled from the top to maybe the would-be people beneficiaries. In most cases, it doesn't trickle down to the people who need it the most. Your thoughts?
That is where the leadership has been the problem in Africa, because deploying that aid to where it is intended is mostly not the case. There's always a misappropriation of these funds, where, for instance, misappropriation does not necessarily mean that it's corruption. Where the money is meant for AIDS and HIV, and you are taking it to other sector, that is still misappropriation. That is why I said these foreign aids too, they should be tied to condition. They should even supervise the execution of these aids. For instance, if it's still there and you send aids to Africa to do malaria, they should monitor it and ensure that that is where the money is deployed. And that's why I said leadership is the key. I've always emphasized it. I think it's even a general norm that leadership has been the problem in Africa. So if we get the leadership, we have some very brilliant African leaders. I can tell you, very brilliant African leaders, but the number is still negligible. So if we have a vast majority of African leaders that see that Africa first, let me use that word, Africa first in this sense will be positive. Getting the resources and using the resources for the African development.
Leonard, you strike me as one of those people who could potentially be one of those leaders in Africa. If you are to be put in a position of leadership right now, using your expertise as a constitutional lawyer, your expertise as a very successful business person, what would you change in the case of Nigeria? How would you go about things?
I would do governance over politics. In Nigeria, for instance, we have a 4-year tenure of office. 4-year tenure. Then after that, there will be election, re-election. You can go for a re-election. But normally, the tenure of leadership in Nigeria is 4 years, either at the presidential level or the sub-regional region, which is the governorship. Now, unfortunately, after the first year, the second year, we'll start playing politics in Nigeria. Politics is hard to be re-elected again. Because in Africa generally, and in Nigeria in particularly, the essence of politics should be governance. Governance is the destination. But when you get to into office in Nigeria, for instance, you are start thinking of the next election cycle. So there is no sufficient time for governance.
Now, but it's the same thing here in the United States. You could argue that here Congress goes for re-election every 2 years, the president is 4 years, but it's the same kind of thing. Already, President Donald Trump is looking at 2028.
Well, I think the difference between the US that we look up to in Africa, there's a delivery of governance, even within the short time. But you cannot see the same case in Nigeria, for instance. Now, because as a president of Nigeria, your policy is not only affecting your party members, it's going to affect every other person. The road you are constructing, the manufacturing giants, or you are bringing all the industries you are establishing, it's for the people. Now, the people, whether they voted for you or not, your impact will be for every other person. And that's the issue. I'm saying that governance should take precedence over politics in Nigeria, for instance. Now, this is what happened. If I am a president of Nigeria, I will never assume I know everything. Now, you have to bring a team, whether they are even in your party or not. That's why I believe that governance is not patronizing only your party faithfuls. There are some other persons from the other side that you have to listen to that can give you idea. That will cut this I know it all syndrome, because you are going to synergize with the opposition party, with all other technocrats. You know, you are even bringing people from outside the continent. We had it in 1999 when the then President Obasanjo brought in a lot of people from outside, from the political cycle, and he did well. Now, that is governance. Governance entails inclusive patronage of your people. Look, the practical solutions to issues. Practical solution. And how do you identify practical solutions in Nigeria or in Africa? It's manufacturing. We are a consuming society. We consume virtually everything foreign. How do you make a budget? Let me give you a typical example. You are making a budget of, for instance, $100 million USD, and you are spending 90 million on recurrent expenditure, maybe salaries and overseas trips. So you have left with just 10 million to develop the infrastructure and in the country. The reverse should be the case. As a president of the country, I'll be spending 90 million on infrastructure and 10 million USD on other expenses. That is it. But now you are spending so much on your recurrent expenditure, you don't have money to develop the fiscal infrastructure. Because at this attitude of consuming, being a consuming nation, anything foreign, why will a minister in Nigeria or even a president having 30 convoy? Why? What for? That is unnecessary. So we'll have to cut down the cost of governance to deliver items that is beneficial to the general public. Now, let me give you a shocking example. If you go to communities in Nigeria, you have very beautiful houses, very beautiful environment, but there are no roads, just tarred road. I mean, access road, you don't have it. And to develop access road on that place, less than 10% of the value of that property in that area. So the fiscal infrastructure is not there. Right. So governance is the key.
How about people who argue that for you to have good infrastructure, you need to borrow money? You need to have these kinds of aids flowing into the country to be able to leverage that aid or the resources coming into the country and build that infrastructure. From what you're saying is that Africa actually doesn't need that, or Nigeria doesn't need that. They have the resources to do that. It's just that their priorities are in different things. So they need to set their priorities right to be able to do and to develop that infrastructure, because they have the resources at their disposal.
If we have our resources and money, even when you misappropriate this money and you use it in the African continent or in the country will still develop. But you are taking it outside. You are taking money that your great-grandchildren in future will not even need. So these are the misapplication of these funds. That's why I said the international community also has to partner and watch out for looted funds from African continent to Europe. Because look, one African leader is looting almost $1 billion, and then you are getting foreign aids of $100 million to Africa. It doesn't make any sense to us. So the practical example is for the international community to watch out and see that funds taken out of Africa return to Africa, and maybe managed by a UN committee or so, until at the point I will get to a point that we'll be able to manage our resources ourselves. Look, if African resources is 90% is even deployed to the development of Africa, Africa will not be where it is. And I keep saying that manufacturing is key in Africa. We should be able to manufacture. We should be able to manufacture vehicles and some other items in Africa, not a consuming continent. Everything we are buying. That is the hallmark.
You've traveled the world. You've lived in the Western world. Why do you think that we are not yet at that level where we can manufacture? What does it take really to have simple manufacturing plants set up across the continent, set up across Nigeria? Does it take political will, what does it take for people to be able to do that easily without thinking about some foreign person coming to build a factory?
Paul, you have said the right word, political will. That's the only thing that is lacking in Africa. Let me use Nigeria as a case study. Political will is lacking. Now, how do you energize manufacturing in your country? You need to start consuming products in your country. Now, in Nigeria, there are local manufacturers of vehicles. But I can tell you, 90% of government offices or agencies don't patronize those vehicles. They see import foreign vehicles to Nigeria. That is total. You are not encouraging those kind of investment. Political will is the language. Now, if you, like I said earlier, if you have the basic infrastructure, electricity is still a problem in Africa. We should be able to fix that. Access road and even pipe-borne water. Those are the basic things. The people will have to develop themselves and come to terms that, look, this is where we are. But when you don't have the political will, you are not patronizing your local production. You are rather importing. I just give you an instance. There's a car manufacturing industry in Nigeria, but 90% of government offices or agencies, or even the government itself, still import vehicles from outside. Now, is this luxury mentality? You want to show off. Vehicle should be an item that can move you from one destination A to destination B. Now, as a leader, you should be able to show example. You cannot tell your citizens to be driving the local vehicle while you are driving foreign. You are not. It's not. You are not motivating the citizenry. I think I'll give it to you that the problem is political will. We do not have that political will. If not, the resources is there. Until you have a leader that lives in Africa, his head is treated in Africa, he consumes African products. That is where real development will come.
The US President Donald Trump would agree with you because he has gotten a lot of criticism because of his America First agenda. He's trying to make sure that people in America patronize American products. He's encouraging American manufacturing. He doesn't want things made in China. He doesn't want things made in Korea. He wants things made here. Yes, he's under a lot of criticism. That's why he's putting tariffs. Are you suggesting that Africans don't understand that? They don't understand why it's important to patronize? You gave a great example of the car manufacturing plants in Nigeria. The government should be using that actually to stop competition from Japanese vehicles coming into Nigeria. They should invest money into that plant to make sure that that plant can create employment for ordinary Nigerians. People can patronize those cars made in Nigeria. It should be a symbol of pride. Just like Aliko Dangote has started refining oil in Nigeria.
Our government should be using products that are manufactured in Africa or in the continent or in the country. Now, you cannot, as a leader, as a president of your country, be using foreign, wearing foreign clothes, doing foreign things of the same that are available in your country. Now, that is very discouraging to the local manufacturing. That's why I said we have identified that political will. As a president, let me assume I'm the president of Nigeria. The clothes I'm wearing is Nigerian made, for instance. The car I'm driving will be Nigerian. So all my my ministers and my aides will be driving Nigerian cars, for instance, or vehicle manufactured in Africa. You cannot see that the economy is circulating, is within the same entity. But you are always dependent on foreign goods. Everything, even to treat yourself. Come on, you are having a little head aching you are flying outside the continent to receive medical treatment. So the underlying factor is still that political will. So we must, that's why I said, no, let me speak like a lawyer now. If we need to have that legislation or that convention that the government should patronize and consume locally made goods. So to me, I'm one of those persons that feel that whatever the American president is doing, Donald Trump, is good for the other countries too. You have to look inward, especially the African continent. Look inward and see how you can sustain yourself. The government in Africa should be able to consume African goods. Now, if you cannot manufacture a vehicle, you'll be able to force yourself. So look, this time we have to encourage local plants. Go and partner with this international company to come and establish plants in your country. It will reduce the cost of governance.
Putting on your lawyer hat, right? What can we learn from the example of United States? Because they're saying, you know what, for us, we are going to ensure that people patronize, we promote local manufacturing, we promote our products made here. How can Africans, African leaders, how can African businessmen, people like you who are in the legal space, help to come up with something that can work for Africa? Something that Africans can look up and say, hey, maybe if we follow this model, it could take us to another level.
Yeah, deliberate legislation and convention. Trump is churning out a lot of executive orders to run his administration. That is his policy guide. In Africa, we need a similar arrangement. That, for instance, if you have an item that is manufactured in Africa, it could be in South Africa, and you are in Nigeria, or be in Nigeria and South Africa, you should be able to patronize the African continent first. Because whether we like it or not, the first law of nature is self-preservation. You must have to look at the indices and say, look, this is cheaper for you to operate. This idea of consuming foreign goods as if it's a status thing, like I said, we are pushing for a legislation that will make our leaders consume African products manufactured in Africa. That is the starting point.
Thank you, Leonard. Sir Leonard Anyogo is a constitutional lawyer and political analyst based in Abuja, Nigeria.